Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The silent fear before the storm. Janice had always imagined motherhood to be a journey of love, warmth, and endless joy. She had spent months preparing for the arrival of her first child, decorating the nursery in soft pastels, folding tiny onesies, and reading every parenting book she could get her hands on. When the day finally came, and she held her newborn baby in her arms, she thought she had finally grasped happiness in its purest form. But what she didn't know was that her life was about to spiral into something unimaginable. Her daughter, whom she and her husband Dan had named Alice, was born after a long and complicated labor. Janice had barely processed the exhaustion before the overwhelming rush of maternal love took over. The tiny, fragile baby nestled against her chest, her breath soft, her delicate fingers wrapping instinctively around Janice's thumb. She was perfect, so small, so innocent, so utterly hers. Dan stood beside them, his face glowing with pride and relief. "She looks just like you," he murmured, brushing a damp strand of hair from Janice's forehead. "She's so small," Janice whispered, looking down at Alice, her voice filled with awe. "I can't believe she's ours." The nurses reassured them that Alice was perfectly healthy. Her little grayish-blue newborn eyes were normal, something that would darken over time, and everything seemed fine. For the first few weeks, their life settled into the chaotic rhythm of parenthood, sleepless nights, diaper changes, and the kind of exhaustion that made Janice feel like she was floating in a haze. But despite it all, she was happy, overwhelmingly happy. Until the night everything changed. It was late, and the house was silent except for the soft hum of the baby monitor. Janice was deep in much-needed sleep when a sharp, terrified scream shattered the silence. "Dan!" Janice bolted upright, her heart hammering. She had never heard her husband scream before, at least not like that. It was raw, strangled, full of something she couldn't quite place. Terror. She shoved the blankets off and rushed down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. The nursery door was wide open, the dim glow from the nightlight casting eerie shadows against the walls. Dan stood frozen by the crib, gripping the wooden railing so tightly that his knuckles were white. His face was drained of color, his eyes locked onto their baby. "Dan," Janice gasped, breathless. "What is it? What's wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. He only raised a shaking hand and pointed at Alice. Janice stepped forward, her stomach twisting with unease. Alice lay in her crib, blinking up at them with wide, curious eyes. But something was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. Alice's once soft, grayish-blue newborn eyes had changed. They were no longer the cloudy, unfocused gaze of an infant. Instead, they glowed. Not in the figurative sense, but in a way that defied nature. Her irises were an intense, electric blue, and there were no pupils, just a perfect, unnatural, luminescent color staring back at them. Janice felt the air leave her lungs. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alice cooed softly, stretching her tiny fingers toward them, utterly oblivious to the horror seizing her parents. Dan stumbled back, shaking his head. This isn't normal." His voice was hoarse, unsteady. "We need to call a doctor." Janice could barely move. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, frozen between logic and the sickening dread pooling in her stomach. She forced herself to act, fumbling for her phone on the nightstand. But her hands trembled so badly, she could barely unlock it. Dan took it from her, his fingers moving with urgency as he dialed. The pediatrician picked up on the third ring, groggy from being woken up. "Dan, it's late," Dr. Patel's voice came through. "What's going on?" Dan inhaled sharply. Something is wrong with Alice. Newborns go through a lot of changes. "No," Dan cut him off, his voice firm, urgent. You don't understand. Her eyes, they're glowing. There are no pupils, just this solid blue color. Silence, a beat too long. Then the doctor's voice came back, sharper this time. Bring her in. Now. Janice had never dressed so fast in her life. She wrapped Alice in a warm blanket, cradling her close to her chest as they rushed out the door. The world outside felt different, as though the air itself had grown heavier. Every instinct inside Janice screamed that something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't some benign medical anomaly. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Janice sat in the back seat with Alice, her heart racing as she stared down at her daughter, praying for some kind of explanation, some rational reason for what was happening. But the unnatural glow in Alice's eyes never dimmed. When they arrived at the hospital, Janice practically burst through the doors, clutching Alice tightly. Please, she gasped to the receptionist. We need to see Dr. Puddle. He's expecting us. The woman barely looked up. Name: Janice Carter. My daughter Alice Carter. Please, it's urgent. Something in Janice's voice must have alarmed the receptionist because she finally glanced up. When her eyes landed on Alice, her breath caught. The woman's fingers froze over her keyboard. I'll call the doctor now. Minutes later, a nurse appeared. Come with me. Janice and Dan followed her through the sterile hallways, their footsteps echoing loudly in the emptiness. The moment they stepped into the examination room, Dr. Patel turned to them, concern etched into every line of his face. Let me see her. Janice hesitated for only a second before carefully placing Alice on the table. The doctor leaned over her, his experienced hands moving gently, his expression unreadable, until Alice blinked. The color drained from his face. For a moment, he just stared. Then, slowly, he reached for a penlight, shining it directly into her eyes. No reaction. The light didn't reflect the way it should. There was no pupil contraction. Nothing. Just that eerie, glowing blue. Janice clutched Dan's arm. Doctor, she whispered, what's wrong with my baby? Dr. Paddle didn't respond immediately. He straightened, exhaling slowly. Then, in a voice lower than a whisper, he murmured, I have never seen anything like this before. Janice's stomach plummeted. Dan's fingers tightened around hers. And in that moment, Janice knew this was only the beginning. The arrest no one expected. Janice sat in the cold hospital room, clutching Alice to her chest, as if her warmth could protect her from whatever terrifying reality they were about to face. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Dr. Patel, a man she had always trusted, stood across the room staring at Alice as though he were looking at something beyond human understanding. Janice swallowed the lump in her throat. Doctor, please, she whispered, her voice shaking. You have to tell us what's happening. Dr. Patel opened his mouth, hesitated, then finally spoke. I don't know. Dan, who had been pacing near the window, suddenly turned to face him. That's not good enough. His voice was sharp, edged with panic. You're a doctor. You've seen thousands of babies. You must have some kind of explanation. Dr. Patel rubbed a hand down his face, looking more unsettled than Janice had ever seen him. I've seen rare conditions, genetic mutations, neurological disorders. But this, he shook his head. Eyes don't glow, Dan. Pupils don't just disappear. This isn't something that's supposed to be medically possible. Janice's hands trembled as she ran her fingers over Alice's tiny head. She was so warm, so small, and yet there was something undeniably different about her. Something she couldn't explain but could feel deep in her bones. We need to run tests, Dr. Peddle continued, his voice lower now, more cautious. Blood work, neurological scans, genetic analysis. Whatever this is, we need to understand it. Janice nodded stiffly. Do whatever you have to do. Dan, however, wasn't so easily convinced. He stepped forward, standing protectively between the doctor and his wife. No tests until you tell us exactly what you're testing for. We are not turning our daughter into a lab experiment." Dr. Patel hesitated again, his lips pressing into a thin line. He was about to respond when the door suddenly burst open. A group of uniformed police officers stormed into the room. Janice gasped, tightening her grip on Alice. The air shifted instantly. The sterile hospital room, now filled with an energy so heavy it made her stomach churn. Dan immediately stepped in front of Janice and Alice. "What the hell is this?" His voice was laced with anger, his posture defensive. "Why are the police here?" The officer in charge, a stern-looking man with graying hair, took a step forward. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I need you to remain calm." "Remain calm." Janice's voice cracked. "You just barged into my child's hospital room. What's going on?" The officer exchanged a brief glance with Dr. Petal before clearing his throat. "We received an emergency report about a newborn exhibiting unnatural physical traits." Dan's face twisted with confusion. "What does that even mean?" The officer hesitated before finally saying the words that made Janice's blood run cold. "Your baby, Alice Carter, is under arrest." Silence fell over the room. Janice stared at the officer, her mind unable to comprehend the words that had just been spoken. "You're arresting a newborn," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Not exactly. We are placing her into federal custody for further examination." Dan's face turned red with fury. "Absolutely not. Over my dead body." Dr. Patel stepped forward, alarmed. "Wait, this is insane. You can't just take their baby away without." The officer cut him off. "Dr. Patel, you don't understand. We received a federal notice about a case like this months ago. Any newborn displaying biological abnormalities beyond human limits is considered a potential national security concern." Janice's breathing became erratic. National security concern. She pulled Alice closer, feeling an overwhelming need to shield her from the strangers in uniform. "She's a baby. My baby. Not some experiment." The officer's face softened for the briefest moment. "Ma'am, I know this is difficult, but we have orders. We need to ensure that whatever is happening here isn't a threat." Dan took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think a newborn is a threat?" His voice was dangerously low, his anger barely restrained. The younger officer standing behind the lead one shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, this is not a normal situation." Her eyes, they aren't human. Janice couldn't breathe. She felt like she was trapped in some kind of nightmare, like at any moment she'd wake up and find herself back in her bed. Alice sleeping peacefully in her crib, her husband murmuring reassurances in the dark. But this was real. This was happening. A nurse who had been silent in the background finally spoke up. I was in the lab when they processed Alice's blood work." Her voice wavered. There was something in it. Something unidentifiable. Dr. Patel turned sharply. "What do you mean?" The nurse swallowed hard. "Her DNA isn't normal." The room fell into a heavier silence. Janice's vision blurred. This couldn't be real. This had to be a mistake. Alice whimpered softly in her arms, sensing her mother's distress. Instinctively, Janice rocked her, whispering, "Sheh, baby, I've got you." The lead officer sighed and stepped closer, his tone gentler now. "Mrs. Carter, I don't want to do this forcibly, but we need to take Alice in for federal examination." Janice's entire body tensed. "No." Dan moved closer to her, standing his ground. "If you want my daughter, you'll have to go through me." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then the officer raised his hand. "I was hoping we could do this peacefully." His voice was solemn. "But if you refuse, we'll have no choice but to take action." Janice's heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't just a medical emergency anymore. This wasn't about doctors and tests. This was about control. Her baby, Her perfect, beautiful Alice was no longer just a child in their eyes. She was an anomaly, a specimen, and they were willing to take her by force. Janice's maternal instincts kicked in with a ferocity she had never known. She turned to Dan, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "We're not letting them take her." Dan didn't hesitate. Never. But the officers were already moving. Janice clutched Alice to her chest, her mind racing. And then, the hospital lights flickered. A low hum filled the air, and Alice's glowing blue eyes suddenly pulsed brighter, as if in response to the fear surrounding her. Then, as if the universe itself had intervened, the entire hospital was plunged into darkness. And in that moment, Janice knew something far bigger than any of them was about to begin. The night everything changed. Darkness swallowed the hospital. The sudden blackout sent a ripple of panic through the room. The steady beeping of machines fell silent, replaced only by the sharp intakes of breath from the officers and hospital staff. For a fraction of a second, everything was still. Then came the screams. Janice gripped Alice so tightly that she feared she might hurt her. But the baby wasn't crying. Instead, Alice remained eerily calm in her mother's arms, her glowing blue eyes cutting through the blackness like two beacons. The lead officer's voice rang through the chaos. "What the hell just happened?" Dan didn't waste a second. "We're leaving. Now." Janice barely registered the words before she felt his strong grip on her wrist, yanking her toward the doorway. The officers were fumbling for their flashlights, their radios crackling with static. Dr. Patel's voice was barely above a whisper. "Get her out of here." One of the nurses yelped as the emergency backup lights flickered weakly to life, casting the hallway in an eerie red glow. The power wasn't fully restored, but it was enough for Janice to see the confusion on everyone's faces. One of the younger officers had his gun drawn. "Stop," he shouted, though his voice wavered. He was just as terrified as the rest of them. Dan turned sharply, his body tense. "You're really going to shoot at a mother holding a newborn?" His voice was filled with so much fury that the officer hesitated. Janice had no time to think. With Dan leading the way, she bolted. The hallways were a blur. Nurses and doctors were moving frantically, some rushing toward patient rooms, others trying to figure out what had caused the sudden outage. Janice's breath came in ragged gasps as she cradled Alice close to her chest. Her baby's skin was warm, her heartbeat steady. But those eyes, they glowed even brighter now. It was as if Alice knew, as if she understood something that no one else did. Dan pulled Janice into a supply closet just as more officers rushed past. He held a finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. Janice could barely contain the tremors racking her body. "Dan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's happening? What's wrong with Alice?" Dan swallowed hard, his eyes dark. "I don't know, but whatever this is, whatever she is, they're scared of her." Janice felt her knees weaken. "They're scared of her." The words echoed in her mind like a curse. Alice cooed softly in her arms, reaching up to touch her mother's face. But when Janice looked down, she nearly dropped her. Alice's irises weren't just glowing anymore. They were changing. They shifted like liquid, swirling from electric blue to an almost white silver, then back again. It was mesmerizing. Beautiful. Terrifying. Janice covered her mouth to stifle a sob. "This isn't normal." Dan placed a protective hand on her back, his body tense. "Nothing about this is normal." The distant sound of heavy boots echoed through the halls. "They're searching for us," Dan muttered. "We need a plan." Janice's mind was spinning. How had it come to this? Hours ago, they were just a normal couple with a newborn. Now, they were running from police officers who thought their baby was some kind of government-level threat. "We can't go home," Janice whispered. Dan nodded grimly. "No, they'll be watching." Janice's pulse pounded. "Then where do we go?" Dan hesitated before finally saying, "I know someone." Janice frowned. "Who?" Dan ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. I didn't want to bring this up. Ever. But my brother, James, he deals with things like this. Janice stiffened. You mean illegal things? Dan didn't deny it. He helps people disappear. If anyone can get us out of this, it's him. Janice wanted to protest. She wanted to scream that this was insane, that they couldn't just disappear. But then she looked down at Alice, and all logic fell away. They had no choice. Okay, she whispered. Call him. Dan didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. 3 rings. Then, a voice. Well, James' voice was smooth, laced with amusement. Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again. Dan didn't bother with pleasantries. We need out. Fast. There was a pause. Then, James' tone turned serious. How bad? Dan exhaled sharply. Life or death. A beat of silence. Then James sighed. All right, little brother. You know the drill. Location. Dan looked at Janice before answering. Street Mary's Hospital. James cursed. You're really in deep, huh? You have no idea, Dan muttered. How fast can you get here? 20 minutes, but you better be ready to move. Dan nodded. We will be. He hung up and turned to Janice. We need to get to the East Wing entrance. That's where he'll pick us up. Janice swallowed hard. And if they catch us before then? Dan's jaw tightened. They won't. He pulled open the closet door and peeked out. The hallway was clear, for now. Janice held Alice closer, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I don't care what she is, Dan, she whispered. She's our daughter. I won't let them take her. Dan cupped her cheek, his eyes softening. Neither will I. Together, they stepped into the hallway, moving quickly but cautiously. Every turn, every step felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of knives. Janice's heart pounded as they neared the East Wing. Almost there. Then, a voice rang out. Stop right there. Janice froze. 4 officers stood at the end of the hallway, guns drawn. Dan pulled Janice behind him. Keep walking, he murmured. The lead officer stepped forward. You're making this worse for yourselves. Dan's grip on Janice's hand tightened. Then, Alice stirred, and the air around them shifted. A strange static charge filled the hallway, making the hair on Janice's arms stand on end. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again. Alice whimpered, and the entire hospital shook. The officers stumbled, their guns lowering slightly. Janice's breath hitched. The very walls seemed to vibrate, like some unseen force had gripped the building itself. And in the middle of it all, Alice's glowing eyes pulsed one last time. Then, everything went silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the officers took an unsteady step back. His face was pale, his hands trembling. And then, he ran. Another officer cursed under his breath and followed. Within seconds, they were gone. Janice's breath came in ragged gasps. What just happened? Dan stared at Alice. I think she made them leave. Janice's mind reeled. That's impossible. Dan exhaled, shaking his head. I don't think impossible applies to our daughter anymore. The hospital was still, empty. The officers had abandoned their pursuit. James' car screeched to a halt outside the East Wing entrance. Dan grabbed Janice's hand. Come on. They ran. Janice didn't look back. Alice whimpered softly, snuggling into her mother's warmth. And as Janice held her close, she knew. This was just the beginning. A new reality begins. The car tore through the darkened streets, its tires screeching as James weaved effortlessly through the quiet city. Janice clutched Alice to her chest, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The moment they had jumped into the vehicle, James had floored the gas pedal, leaving the hospital, and the nightmare behind them, in seconds. But Janice knew better. They weren't free. They were fugitives. Dan sat beside her, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the road ahead. His hands were balled into fists, his entire body tense with the kind of rage Janice had never seen before. He wasn't just afraid. He was furious. Furious that they had almost lost Alice. Furious that the government was after their child. James, on the other hand, was calm. Too calm. So, he finally said, voice low, "Anyone want to tell me why my little brother called me in the middle of the night asking me to smuggle a newborn out of a damn hospital?" Dan exhaled sharply. "It's complicated." James scoffed. Clearly. Janice's grip on Alice tightened. She didn't trust James, not entirely. Dan's brother had a reputation, one he had spent years running from. He wasn't just some guy with connections. He was dangerous. But right now, he was their only hope. Dan rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "It's Alice. There's something different about her." James glanced at the baby in Janice's arms through the rearview mirror. Different how? Janice hesitated. Saying it out loud felt too surreal, too terrifying. But there was no more hiding. "She's not normal," she whispered, forcing the words out. Her eyes, they glow. Not in a metaphorical way. Literally. No pupils. Just pure blue light. James' hands tightened on the wheel, but he didn't interrupt. "She did something back there," Janice continued. "At the hospital. When the officers cornered us, they were about to take her. But then the lights flickered, the whole building shook, and then they just ran." James let out a low whistle. Dan's voice was hard. "We don't know what she is." James didn't respond immediately. He was thinking, his dark eyes scanning the streets like a predator. Finally, he muttered, "Yeah, I might know someone." Dan turned sharply. "What?" James sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I have a contact. Used to work for the government. Real hush-hush stuff. If Alice is different, there's a chance they've seen something like this before." Janice's heart pounded. And if they haven't? James' lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we figure it out ourselves." Silence filled the car. Janice glanced down at Alice, who had finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. Her tiny chest rose and fell in soft, rhythmic movements. She looked just like any other newborn. But Janice knew her daughter was anything but ordinary. She wasn't sure if that scared her or made her more determined. She met Dan's gaze, their unspoken words heavy in the air. They were in this together, no matter what. James took a sharp left turn, heading toward the outskirts of the city. The bright lights of civilization faded, replaced by vast stretches of empty road. "Where are we going?" Dan finally asked. James smirked. "Somewhere safe." Janice wasn't sure if she believed that. They drove for nearly an hour, deeper into the quiet countryside. The tension in the car remained thick, suffocating. Every second felt like a countdown to something bigger, something inevitable. Finally, James pulled onto a dirt road, the car bumping along the uneven path. Janice squinted into the darkness. A cabin. Isolated. Hidden. James cut the engine. "We're here." Dan frowned. "Who's here?" James turned in his seat, his face unreadable. "Someone who owes me a favor." Janice's stomach twisted. This was insane. They were trusting a criminal, relying on an unknown contact, hiding from the government, all because of Alice. But what choice did they have? Dan was already out of the car, scanning their surroundings. Janice hesitated for only a second before following, cradling Alice against her chest. The night was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. James knocked on the wooden door 3 times. Silence. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her sharp brown eyes flicking over them with quiet calculation. She was in her mid-40s, her short, graying hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She didn't look surprised to see them. "James," she said flatly. James grinned. "Miss me, Doc?" The woman sighed. "No." Then she looked past him, her gaze landing on Janice and Alice. She stiffened. "So," she murmured, "this is the baby." Dan stepped forward, his stance protective. "Who are you?" The woman studied him for a long moment before finally answering. "Dr. Evelyn Carter, former geneticist, former government researcher." And her gaze flickered to Alice, "Probably the only person who can tell you what's really happening to your daughter." Janice's breath caught. Dan's hands clenched at his sides. "Then start talking." Dr. Carter nodded, stepping aside. "Come inside. We don't have much time." Janice hesitated. Something about this woman made her uneasy. But she had already made up her mind. Holding Alice close, she stepped inside. Dan followed. James lingered by the door, scanning the darkened woods. "We weren't followed," he murmured, "but they'll come looking soon." Dr. Carter didn't seem fazed. "They always do." She led them into a small living room cluttered with papers, old computer monitors, and strange devices Janice couldn't even begin to understand. Dr. Carter motioned for them to sit. Janice did, adjusting Alice in her arms. Dr. Carter leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Dan wasted no time explaining. The birth, the glowing eyes, the hospital, the blackout, the incident that made the officers flee. Dr. Carter listened intently, her fingers steepled under her chin. When Dan finished, she exhaled slowly. "I thought it was just a theory," she muttered, "but I was wrong." Janice's pulse quickened. "A theory." Dr. Carter turned to her, her gaze sharp. "Alice isn't just different. She's evolved." Silence. Janice's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "Years ago, I worked for a classified government division studying genetic anomalies, rare mutations, cases that defy human biology. We believe that under the right conditions, a person's DNA could adapt, accelerate beyond normal evolution." Dan's voice was cold. "You're saying Alice is some kind of advanced human?" Dr. Carter nodded. "Or something more." Janice felt the world tilt. "That's impossible." Dr. Carter's gaze flicked to Alice. "Is it?" Alice stirred, her tiny fingers curling against Janice's shirt. The soft glow in her eyes dimmed slightly, as if she was listening. Dr. Carter leaned back. "I don't know how or why it happened, but I do know this. If the government is after her, it's not just because she's different." Janice's stomach churned. "Then why?" Dr. Carter's expression darkened. "Because they think she's the first." Dan stiffened. "The first what?" Dr. Carter's voice was eerily calm. "The first of a new species." A chill ran down Janice's spine. Alice whimpered softly. And outside, in the distance, the sound of approaching helicopters shattered the silence. The last goodbye before the beginning. The sound of helicopter blades tore through the night sky, a deafening roar that sent a cold wave of terror through Janice. The house trembled under the force of the wind, papers scattering across the floor as Dr. Carter's expression hardened. "They found us." Her voice was calm, but her movements were sharp. She was already standing, moving toward a metal case tucked behind the couch. Dan grabbed Janice's arm. "We have to run. Now." Janice's arms instinctively tightened around Alice. She could feel her daughter's warmth against her chest, her tiny fingers curling against her skin. But there was something else, something different. The faint glow in Alice's eyes was pulsing now, flickering like a heartbeat. Janice looked at Dr. Carter. "Tell me the truth. If they take Alice, what will they do to her?" Dr. Carter exhaled sharply, flipping open the metal case. Inside was a tablet displaying encrypted files. She tapped on one, revealing a classified government document. It was labeled, "Project to GNESIS." "They won't experiment on her," Dr. Carter admitted. "Not exactly." She turned the screen toward them. "They'll control her." Janice's breath caught. The file contained diagrams, notes, calculations that made no sense to her. But one thing stood out. A single word. Weapon. Janice's knees buckled. She had been afraid of Alice being seen as an anomaly. But they didn't see her daughter as a mystery to be solved. They saw her as a tool to be used. Dan swore under his breath, "We have to go." He turned to James, who was already locking the front door, his fingers flying over his phone screen. "Tell me you have an exit plan." James smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I always have an exit plan." Before Janice could respond, the first explosion hit. The front wall of the cabin burst inward, a shockwave sending splinters flying. James grabbed Janice and Dan, pulling them back as dust and debris filled the air. The red beams of laser sights cut through the smoke. They were surrounded. A voice crackled through a megaphone outside. "Janice Carter. Hand over the child." Janice's entire body tensed. The soldiers outside weren't cops. They weren't even regular military. Their armor was black, their helmets featureless. They looked like ghosts. Dan moved in front of Janice. "You're not taking her." The voice continued, eerily calm. "You have nowhere to run. This is not a have to end in violence." Janice barely heard them. Her ears were ringing. The world was tilting. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Then she felt it. The shift in the air. The strange static charge humming around them. Alice's glow intensified. Dr. Carter's eyes widened. "It's happening." James looked at her sharply. "What's happening?" But Janice knew. Alice was awakening. Janice looked down at her daughter, at the impossible, beautiful light radiating from her tiny body. She wasn't just glowing now. She was emitting energy. The moment Alice opened her eyes, the air rippled outward in a wave. A shockwave of force blasted from her tiny body. The lights went out. The soldiers screamed. The helicopter above them spun wildly, the engine failing midair before it crashed into the trees. Janice felt it. The raw, untamed power in Alice. The air vibrated with energy, pulsing outward in shockwaves. Windows shattered. Metal bent. The very ground trembled beneath them. The soldiers outside were frozen. Some dropped their weapons. Others collapsed, clutching their helmets, as if something was inside their heads, inside their minds. Dan's breath came in short gasps. "Janice." She turned to Dr. Carter. "Tell me what to do." The older woman's face was pale. "There's only one way this ends." Janice's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" Dr. Carter stepped closer, voice steady. "You can run. Keep hiding. But they'll never stop hunting her. They'll never stop fearing what she is." Janice's throat was dry. "And the other option?" Dr. Carter's eyes softened. "You let her choose." Janice's breath hitched. "She's a baby." Dr. Carter shook her head. "No, she's not." And somehow, Janice knew she was right. Alice wasn't like other babies. She was aware. And she was waiting. Janice knelt, holding Alice close. "Baby," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's okay. Whatever you need to do, I'm here." Alice blinked up at her, those glowing, shifting eyes filled with something too deep for a child. And then she spoke. Her voice was not human, not in the way a newborn should sound, but it was gentle. "Mommy, I go now." Janice's heart stopped. "No," she choked. "No, baby, please." Alice's small hand pressed against Janice's cheek. Warm, loving, final. And then, the world shattered. A column of light erupted from Alice's tiny body, stretching into the sky. The ground trembled. The air vibrated. The soldiers outside collapsed, unconscious. Janice tried to hold on, but Alice's form was dissolving into the light. She was becoming something more. "Alice," Janice sobbed, reaching for her. "Don't go, please." Alice's eyes met hers one last time, and she smiled. Then, she was gone. The light vanished. The air fell still, and Janice was left on her knees, empty arms trembling. The silence was deafening. Dan knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her shaking frame. Janice whispered, voice broken. She's gone. Dr. Carter exhaled softly. She's not gone. Janice looked up, eyes wet with tears. Dr. Carter's gaze lifted to the sky. She's just where she belongs now. Janice followed her gaze. Above them, the sky was different. The stars looked brighter. And for the first time in her life, Janice felt peace. She pressed a hand to her chest, right where Alice's warmth still lingered. And she smiled. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.